Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Partnership on AI. The Partnership on AI is a nonprofit partnership of academic, civil society, industry, and media stakeholders. Along with our partners, SPI identifies issues, opportunities, and solutions related to AI design and deployment to benefit people and bring greater awareness of AI risks and harms. My name is Katya Klinova. I am the head of the Labor and Economy portfolio of programs at the Partnership on AI. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you at our webinar today to discuss SPI's most recent report on AI and job quality, featuring insights from frontline workers across the globe. The release of this report is an important milestone for the AI and Shared Prosperity Initiative, which we founded a little over 2 years ago to steer AI advancement in service of shared prosperity and inclusive economic growth. Under the guidance of a distinguished multidisciplinary steering committee, the initiative works on developing practical guidance for how to categorize AI systems based on the severity and likelihood of their labor market impacts and how to give workers a real say in the AI development and deployment process. We hope that this guidance will be used by AI practitioners, policymakers, unions, and other stakeholders to inform their efforts around ensuring the age of AI brings about flourishing and not immiseration of working people everywhere. You can download the report on AI and job quality, which we'll be discussing today, as well as other inputs of the AI and Shared Prosperity Initiative at the partnership-on-AI.org/shared-prosperity. We'll also put this link and all of the future links I'll be mentioning to the chat. And now, let me introduce the author of the report on AI and job quality, SPI's research scientist, Dr. Stephanie Bell. Stephanie leads SPI work on designing corporate commitments on responsible AI. In her research, she's particularly interested in finding ways to include the perspectives of frontline workers in AI design and development, and exploring how AI can create better opportunities for low-wage workers. Prior to joining PEI, Stephanie was an engagement manager at McKinsey & Company and advised nonprofits and foundations as a consultant at the Bridgespan Group. She holds a doctorate in philosophy and politics from the University of Oxford, where she studied as a Rhodes Scholar. To discuss the report, we're also joined today by two incredible scholars and leaders, Laura Nursky and Christina Colclough, who I'll also introduce before turning it over to Stephanie to present highlights from the new report. Welcome, Dr. Laura Nursky. She is a research fellow at Bruegel. She leads the Future of Work and Inclusive Growth project, which analyzes the impact of technology on the nature, quantity, and quality of work, welfare systems, and inclusive growth. Before joining Bruegel, Laura investigated the impact of job design and organization design on well-being and productivity at work. Laura holds a PhD in industrial organization from University Leuven. Laura has published extensively on the topic of job quality and the impact of digital technologies and AI are making on job quality. We'll post links to her work, which I highly recommend checking out in the chat now as well. And also welcome Dr. Christina Colclough, who is the founder of the Why Not Lab, which she created as a dedication to improving workers' digital rights. Christina is a widely recognized thought leader on the future of workers and the politics of digital technology. She has extensive global labor movement experience where she led future of work policies, advocacy, and strategies. She was the author of the union movement's first principles on worker data rights and the ethics of AI. Christina is a fellow at the Royal Society of Arts in the UK. She's included in the all-time Hall of Fame of the world's most brilliant women in AI ethics. And these are just a couple of her many titles and accomplishments. If you aren't familiar with Christina's work already, I highly recommend checking it out at the whynotlab.com. We'll post a link in the chat. With that, let me turn the microphone over to Stephanie to introduce her latest research and share key insights from it, and then we'll invite Laura and Christina to share their responses. I also invite all of you attending to submit questions at any moment throughout the webinar through the Q&A. You can also post them in the chat. We'll make sure to set time at the end to answer as many of those as we can, and would love for you all to join this discussion. Stephanie, with that, over to you.
Katya, thanks so much for that introduction. And thank you, Laura and Christina, for joining us, as well as everybody else who's joining us wherever they happen to be in the world today. Let me go ahead and share my screen to start the presentation here. So as Katya mentioned, this research is a part of the Partnership on AI's AI and Shared Prosperity Initiative. This is a program where we're working to ensure that artificial intelligence advances an abundance of good jobs for workers, regardless of their skill profile, their personal demographics, or the geography in which they're located. In order to do that, we're aiming to create what we've been referring to as shared prosperity targets, voluntary commitments for companies, as well as policies and regulations focused on expanding the number of good jobs in the economy. This work is guided by the AI and Shared Prosperity Steering Committee. And I realize it's always a bit bold to put a page full of slide 10 or size 10 text up here. The important thing that I want to highlight is that we've had a group of wonderful academics, practitioners within the AI research space, business leaders, as well as civil society members who are focused on the well-being and the rights of workers, who have helped shape all of this work. And that goes for the AI and job quality report that I'm about to discuss. So thank you very much to everybody who has participated on our steering committee. We're grateful for all of your support and your insights. So to kick off, I thought it'd make sense to discuss why begin to focus on job quality to begin with. Presumably a number of you are here because you thought the subject sounded interesting. But when people talk about the AI and the future of work, very frequently job quality is something that gets ignored in favor of discussions about job loss, about automation, those kinds of concerns. The reality of what AI adoption looks like on the ground, however, is that there's an increasing number of workers who are seeing AI in their daily work, in their jobs on a regular basis, and who are seeing its impacts firsthand, both for good and for bad. And so when we decided to take on this work, we decided that it was important to try and better understand sort of what those impacts look like at a more detailed level, and whether we could draw some conclusions about artificial intelligence as a workplace technology as a whole, in all of its different applications and lots of different industries and usages. And so that's intended to help us better understand where there are opportunities for workers to participate in improving the impacts of AI, both on their own job conditions and working environments and job quality, as well as opportunities to contribute to their company. It's one of the founding principles of our work, and as well as of this report, that workers should be treated as experts in their own roles, regardless of the role that they have in the organization. As I'm sure anybody out there who has had a job themselves knows, if you've been the person who's been doing the work day in and day out, you develop a kind of deep expertise within it. Part of our argument here and part of our research demonstrates that it's really important to take that expertise seriously. And that means that including workers and ensuring that they have influential participation in the design and the implementation of AI is a really important aspect of success, both in terms of their own job quality as well as business outcomes for companies. So the research itself is based on 80 different technology journals that we asked workers around the world to keep, following specific prompts and questions about their experiences of the AI technologies that they use in their jobs. And then we had the opportunity to speak with 40 of those journal keepers to better understand some of their remarks and their reflections, to get to know their stories better. And so the insights that I'm about to share with you are very much rooted in their own experiences and the insights that they shared and the stories that they told us. And we had the opportunity to speak with workers who were customer service representatives located in India, data annotators located in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's a group of folks who are basically building the data sets that fuel artificial intelligence models of all different types around the world, as well as warehouse workers in the United States. So a wide variety of different occupations, technologies, and also regulatory conditions that workers were encountering these technologies in. So in terms of major themes and findings, we had 5 of them in the report, and I'll walk through them one by one. So the first one to highlight is that executive and managerial decisions truly shape AI's impacts on workers. And when I phrase it like that, it probably comes across as slightly obvious. But when we take a step back to the way that these technologies tend to be discussed in the broader public, or even in trade journals or business journals, a lot of the focus is on, AI does this, AI does that. And it kind of erases the human agency behind how that AI is being used, right? We aren't at a point where any of these technologies are truly autonomous. There's always some human who's making a decision, and usually many, many humans who are making decisions about the way that they're being used in workplaces. And those decisions are the things that ultimately shape the effects that they have. And if you take a look, for instance, at the types of decisions that people make that create those conditions for AI's impacts, a lot of them are things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as technology decisions. They have to do with things like business models or operating models. Do you, for instance, want to create a highly skilled workforce that you have the opportunity to rely on the judgment and wisdom and expertise of? And that might require some additional training, some additional credentialing. Effectively, it's a harder workforce to build. Or would you make the decision that you'd rather rely on a workforce that doesn't have perhaps the same level of credentialing, that doesn't rely on the same level of skills or expertise. And as a result, you don't need to train as much, and you can tolerate higher levels of churn. As I'm describing those 2 different types of jobs, I think you might be able to kind of start to form a perception in your head as to which one of those is probably better paid. It's definitely the job where there's a higher amount of discretion or judgment or expertise involved. And which one of them has probably worse working conditions in addition to lower pay? It's the second category. And a lot of the technologies that are being released right now, especially those that are targeting automation, are trying to increase the ability of companies to create kind of workforces that look more like that second group. In the report that we did, we saw that there were a number of different ways that when managers are making these decisions, that they chose to either give additional levels of discretion to their workers, or that they chose to allocate discretion that had previously been given to the workers, right? Decision-making power and judgment, decisions that they've been allocated to technologies instead. All of those are things that have very strong impacts as to whether or not a worker enjoys the job, stays in it longer, whether or not they decide that this is a place that they might want to stick around for the long term or make a career out of. Another place where we see managerial decisions making a huge difference in the way that workers experience AI has to do with whether these technologies are understood to be sort of final decision-making authorities or merely, sort of inputs into a broader set of decisions being made by a set of humans. Especially when it comes to things like performance reviews, where some of the call center workers that we spoke with said, in some of the companies that they worked in, these were just used as coaching tools. And in other instances, they were used as evaluative tools. They affected their ratings. The workers strongly preferred the opportunity to have, a human influence in that decision, because at this point, those tools are not, particularly effective at understanding the full context of everything that the workers are doing in the course of their jobs. And it's unclear that they ever will be able to understand that full context. The second theme that we found in the report, in the research, was that workers really do appreciate some aspects of AI in their work. And 2 questions that we asked workers in the context of this research were, first off, how they'd describe a good day at work, and second off, how they'd define what it means for them to do a good job in their role. In each of those cases, there was a very consistent through line in the responses that we received from workers, which is that all of them appreciated the opportunity to do work that they found to be meaningful, as well as that they thought very heavily about what it meant to do their work well. If they were talking about what it meant to have a good day at work, they often included that they did a good job in their role. There's a high level of alignment between what workers think of their own work in the context of their company, and what their company thinks of their expectations for the workers. And so what that means in the context of AI and different technological tools that you could use to be able to support work, the more that those tools are used in ways that workers find to augment their jobs and to benefit them, the more appreciative they are of having the opportunity to be able to rely on them. On the other hand, if these tools are being used in ways that are taking away some of their kind of core tasks or things that they take pride in their jobs, those are areas where workers are less appreciative of AI technology being involved, frequently because these technologies will make different decisions than they would in the same context. The third main finding that we had is that workplace AI's harms are not new or novel. In a lot of discussions about artificial intelligence, there's speculation that perhaps we just won't be able to foresee the effects that AI will have. At least in the case of AI that's being introduced in workplaces right now, it's actually repeating a lot of the harms of technologies in the past. It's being used in ways that cause workers additional stress, in ways that cause workers to undergo additional injuries in physical jobs like warehouse work. It's also being used in ways that continue to remove worker discretion across the board. Each of these are things that we've seen with other technological advances over time, some of which have required dedicated regulation to ensure that workers are protected from those harms. All of this is to say that as we're thinking about the ways that we can all improve AI's impact on job quality, we have real opportunity to look to the harms of the past and the present of other technologies and use those as guideposts to understand or anticipate the ways that AI, either currently or might in the future, lead to harms for workers. Our fourth finding is that workplace AI, and this is a bit of a counterintuitive one, often actually decreases workers' ability to exercise what are frequently described as kind of human skills or abilities. So a lot of early writing about artificial intelligence in the workplace or in the context of jobs or the economy speaks about how AI is supposed to be able to free all of us all up to do more empathetic work, to do work that involves higher levels of kind of analytical thinking or judgment. And as a result, for people who appreciate having those kinds of challenges in their jobs, they'll ultimately end up with a more fulfilling role. Unfortunately, what we're seeing at present, and this was true in all three of the sites that we looked at, is that workers are actually seeing a reduction in their ability to exercise those supposedly human skills like empathy or judgment. Instead, what's happening is that a lot of these technologies are aiming to automate some of those skills straight out of the gate. For call center workers, for instance, this involves technologies that are being used to try and automate not just the specific resolution that they're giving a customer, but also their tone of voice, their pace of speaking. All of these different ways that might signal how they're building a relationship with a customer are things that AI is now trying to intervene in and issue judgments on. And so we're seeing some of these skills actually being taken out of the hands of workers. The workers who highlighted each of these issues highlighted them as a genuine concern, that they appreciated prior levels of challenge in their job, or they appreciated the autonomy that they had to be able to complete the role as they saw fit. The fifth and final theme is that empowering workers in the context of AI creation and use enables us all to have opportunities to create some of the benefits that I was just speaking about in bullet 2 here, and avoid some of the harms from bullet 3. Workers are genuinely experts in their own roles, and they come up with different problems as well as different solutions to people from other vantage points within their companies. Unfortunately, right now, a lot of the way that AI is produced and then sold focuses not on the workers and the needs that they could identify, but on people in other roles in the company who might hold, for instance, the budget and the needs that are being identified at that level. Bringing workers into that loop in a way that empowers them is an opportunity both for workers to improve their job quality, as well as an opportunity for companies that create AI and companies that use AI to be able to reap higher benefits in terms of business outcomes. So just speaking very quickly here about some opportunities for stakeholders before turning over to the discussants. The first opportunities that we saw were for AI creating companies. And here we think the real opportunity is creating technologies that are worker-centric, that take the opportunity to create something that workers really enjoy using as their main goal, and to use that as almost a calling card. There's possibly some developers out there in the audience who are saying, well, that's exactly what they should be doing. That's their job, is to create technologies that people love using. But that sort of disconnect that I spoke about between who holds the budget and who actually uses the technology seems to be creating some barriers to that occurring in this particular realm. This is particularly true in instances where, for instance, you have lower power workers, like a number of the folks that I spoke with for this research, who don't have a strong amount of influence in their companies. Second, for AI implementing companies, the main suggestion here, and this is something that I tipped my hand on when I was describing theme 5, is to really bring workers into the discussion. We've seen time and time again the value that can be generated by treating frontline workers as experts in the jobs that they do, in the work that they complete. And that's true in terms of the technologies they're using as well. They might not have the sort of, technical savvy of somebody within, the sort of technology division of the company, but they have a very good understanding of what the work is to be done and what they'd like assistance with. And bringing them into that loop gives an opportunity for those two teams to really double down on both of their strengths. When it comes to worker organizations and unions, we'd suggest here that there's a couple of different opportunities. The first is to collaborate with workers to help build education on these types of technologies and on the ways that they turn up in workplaces. Right now, a lot of workers rightfully don't necessarily make connections between, sort of managerial targets they might be given, for instance, in the context of warehouse work, how quickly they might need to process an object, and the technology behind it that drives it. Here we see an opportunity to really build worker skills and abilities to advocate for themselves, and ideally something that these organizations like unions would be able to integrate into negotiations in the future. Policymakers should have the opportunity to really double down on the ability to enforce as well as regulate violations of worker rights that happen in workplaces. This is an area where already a lot of countries struggle, but this is something where, as technology becomes increasingly prevalent in workplaces, it's extremely important for policymakers to be able to get involved and have a sufficient level of savvy about the way these technologies function to be able to create sound and useful policy and enforce existing rules on the books. And then finally, investors. The obvious opportunity here might be ESG investing. But we also think that there's an opportunity for anybody out there who's interested in a kind of job quality thesis behind their investment strategy, which is an increasingly popular area that investors are starting to explore. We'd suggest for anybody who's taking that tack to look closely at the types of technologies that are involved and to make sure that they have the opportunity to understand from workers' perspectives how all of these things can be improved. And that's a brief summary of the research. Katya, thanks so much for the floor, and I'll hand it back to you for the discussants.
Thanks so much for the research, Stephanie, and for the highlights. I'll turn it over now to Dr. Laura Nursky and then to Christina to share their reflections and to also open up our aperture about how we are thinking about this. So, Laura, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Stephanie and Katya and Christina. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I prepared a few slides to discuss this. I hope you can all see it, right? Yeah, excellent. Yes. So, well, congratulations, Stephanie, on delivering this exciting report. It was a pleasure to read it and to prepare my thoughts and reactions to this. So I couldn't agree more with you that we need to hear more about worker perspectives and their experiences in this discussion on the future of work. And as you rightly point out in the report, the decisions on acquisitions and implementations of new technologies in the workplace, they're usually made by CEOs and COOs and CTOs, and then they're designed by ICT professionals and developers, while their actual impact on jobs happens several levels down in a hierarchy of the organization. So in my discussion, I wanted to focus on two things. First, I just want to reinforce your message that it's not so much the specific technology that shapes the impact on job quality, but that it's the occupational status of workers and the decisions that their managers make on how to implement these technologies. And second, I want to share with your audience, which I assume is mainly US-based, I wanted to share a bit of insight into the current state of European regulation on workplace AI, as that's where I'm based. So on the first point, let me share with you two examples of algorithmic work method instructions. So these are algorithms that help people decide on how to do their work. So they either support or direct them depending on how strictly they're supposed to be followed. So on the left-hand side, there is Rita. She's a lab technician. She works in a company that processes a large number and a large variety of lab samples each day. So before this new technology was introduced, she was required to assess each incoming sample and then decide on which steps of processing it needed to process and analyze this sample. Now, the problem was that her company couldn't find or couldn't keep enough of these skilled lab technicians. So what they did was they installed what they called a knowledge management system, where this system would scan an incoming sample. It would recognize what type of sample it was and how it needed to be processed. And then it would give the operator or the technician a list of 4 or 5 steps on how to handle this. Now, this was a serious simplification of this job. It was meant to be as well so that they could hire less skilled workers for this job. Now, for the remaining technicians, their job was much less challenging. They didn't need to use their own skills and own judgment anymore. And there was less opportunity for them to keep developing and keep growing. I want to compare this example to another one on the right-hand side. This one is François. He's an anesthetist. His job requires him to monitor a few computer screens during a patient's anesthesia that show him the patient's vital signs like breathing and oxygen measurements. In addition, he also has to clinically observe the patients physically, like the skin of their color, the color of their skin, and the movements of their chests while they're under anesthesia. And then he has to perform some other activities like titrating drugs. So as a result, during periods of high workload, he cannot always keep all of these elements in his sight. So what the hospital did for him was they gave him Google glasses, or they set up an experiment with 40 anesthetists. They gave them Google glasses, and the Google glasses gave them all of the relevant input and information at the relevant time, so that they could have a better, clearer view of all the information that they needed. Now, the Google Glass didn't tell them when to intervene when something was going wrong with the patient. They just showed them the information, and then the anesthetist still had to decide when there was a need for a clinical intervention. Now, the difference with Rita is that at the end of this experiment, they asked the anesthetists how this technology could be improved according to them. So I'll show you here the results. So half of the anesthetists said that they just wanted to see more information in their Google glasses. Well, actually only 2 out of the 40 asked for clinical decision support, meaning that they didn't want their Google glasses to tell them how to do their job. They wanted to keep that decision right to themselves. Of course, they also knew that having these discretion and these skills makes them extremely valuable to the hospital, and they didn't want to give up this power. And the difference between Rita and François is that François was asked about how do you want this technology to work for you, and Rita was not asked. So those were 2 anecdotes, but in general, we see that there's huge differences in the level of autonomy and the level of skill use and discretion along occupations, and that they correspond quite well to the levels of the position that they take in the hierarchy of an organization. So in the upper hand right, you see managers and professionals who they score high on the x-axis, so they have high workloads and challenging work, but they also score high on the y-axis, so they have a lot of decision power, a lot of skill use. And when it comes to AI and technology development in general, it's actually those group of people on the upper right-hand side who design jobs and technologies for people in the lower half of this graph. So that was a bit to reinforce the message that Stephanie already gave in her report. And then to conclude, I wanted to share with the audience a bit of an overview of the European regulation. I also have a lot of text here, and one caveat is that I'm not a lawyer or a legal expert, so this is just my interpretation as an economist. But we have 3 main relevant regulations. The first is, of course, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is in essence a privacy regulation. So it regulates the collection of personal data, and it ensures the right not to be fully subjected to automated decision-making. Now, there are some pitfalls to this regulation, and in the link that Josh kindly put in the chat, you can read a bit in more detail what we see as the pitfalls there. But one of them is that it's primarily focused on the stage of data collection and not so much on what happens with the data afterwards. Then there's the famous proposed AI Act, which is still under negotiation, which wants to promote AI in Europe while protecting public interests such as health, safety, and human rights. So the difference with the previous regulation is that this is really a product safety regulation. So the aim is to ensure that products that enter the European single market are safe to sell and use. It takes a risk-based approach, so it defines categories of risk, and it puts employment applications of AI in the high-risk area. So that includes recruitment selection, but also monitoring, task allocation, etc. And for those providers of high-risk systems, they impose some requirements, such as you can see them on the slide, so risk management systems, data governance, documentation, etc. The problem here is that it's only required through a self-assessment. So of course, in the workplace, first of all, it's not always so clear if the employer is the provider or not, if they are developing the AI themselves or buying it, and then what are the responsibilities between the developer and the employer. But mostly self-assessment is not sufficient in the workplace, of course, and I'm sure that Christina will speak a lot more about that. And finally, we have the Platform Workers Directive, which is in fact a labor regulation, also still under negotiation. It's proposed. And since this is a labor regulation, it has a lot of attention for worker information and consultation. But here the downside is that it's only aimed for people working through platforms, which is still quite a small group in the total economy. And as we've seen in Stephanie's report, but also in the examples I gave, AI in the workplace extends much beyond just platform work. So I'll leave it at this, and then I'll be happy to come back in the discussion later.
Lara, thank you so much for this reflection and for adding the regulatory perspective view from Europe. Really helpful for us to keep that in mind as we're thinking about like what needs to be happening to improve outcomes around AI's impact on job quality. And let me turn it over to Christina now, and then John, I'm seeing a hand from you, and I'll call to hear your question after Christina's presentation as we move into the Q&A part. Dr. Christina Colclough, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katja, and really great to hear the comments from Laura, and of course to read the report by Stephanie. So a few comments from my side, and it's really difficult to actually pick out what to say, but more importantly, what not to say in the brief minutes that I have here. But first of all, a big celebration, of course, to Stephanie, to the Partnership on AI for writing this report. And I really want to thank you for putting something on the agenda, which some of us are fighting very hard to raise awareness around the issues of workers' experience in both having to run, but also being subject to AI/ML systems. So I really do welcome your report. Now, I could say a lot of things, and one of them you briefly mentioned in the report, but could, I think, draw that out a little bit more. And that is what I call the Pac-Man effect. And the Pac-Man here is how, if you can see me on the screen, I don't know if you can, but how the developers of these systems are actually changing the balance or the nature of the relationship between management and employees in deploying companies. So distinguishing a lot between the developers, vendors, and then the deployers is what we see around the world really important, because this has to do with what are the contracts, if it's procurement or supplier contracts, and therefore what are the rights of data access control, but also the rights to amend algorithmic systems, for example. Money, you mentioned that, Stephanie. You know, a lot of AI systems could do a lot of good for the workers. We could imagine an algorithm that trawled through a company's behavior to ensure that it at all times was in compliance with the law and or collective agreements. We could imagine algorithmic systems that redistributed tasks, that redistributed working time. We could imagine algorithmic systems which took far more into account the soft competencies that Stephanie was mentioning. The problem is, and the list continues, that none of these systems exist. Why? Well, I could provokingly say that venture capital has no interest in being good. So a little provocative thought here, but this leads me to the next thing, which is a person walking over there on the right is the neglected worker's voice. Very few workers, unions are actually invited to participate in discussions of AI governance, of AI development. And this is a very strong point in your report, Stephanie, I think should be highlighted. I could also talk about the narratives around the wonders and the woes of technology. And one of them, now I don't have that graph with me here, but one of them is the promise of increased productivity and efficiency. Yet interestingly, you look at the OECD, labor productivity growth has declined at the same time as there's been an exponential growth in workplace technologies. So this is a mystery. This is not about productivity and efficiency necessarily. It is more about power. And then lastly, I could talk a lot about human rights, why I think we should have a human rights perspective on this rather than a purely ethical one. But again, all these topics I will save for another time, because right now I want to focus on inclusive governance. Now, this is mirrored very much in Stephanie's report, but one thing that is fundamental to any discussion of governments is the admittance and the realization that it's time to change. That a lot of industrial relations or a lot of relations between management and labor are of a boxing nature. You win, I lose. It is as if the respect for the worker has been thrown straight out the window. And if we at all are going to turn the tides here, tap into the potentials, the positive, constructive potentials of AI systems and technologies, we're going to have to learn to talk again. We need to bring dialogue back into vogue. So this would be one big thing here. And from Stephanie's report, I've just highlighted some of the recommendations she has towards the employers here, which more or less are saying, bring the workers in, listen to their voices, integrate them into both the development and the deployment of these systems. I couldn't agree more. And then, of course, on the unions and workers is foreground the worker voice. Now, what is missing to a certain extent is the acknowledgement that the general public, including the vast, vast majority of workers, have no idea what AI, algorithms, data really is. You know, you don't know what you don't know. And you don't know, you should be asking questions about the instructions to the algorithm, the training data, et cetera, if you have never been told that these can and are important things which can have a severe negative impact on your work life, on quality jobs. So that's one thing. On the worker side, we need the competencies. But Stephanie, as well, in your recommendations, you do what many others do and seem to assume that managers know what they're dealing with. And in every single company, both public and private, that I work with and across the world, it is very, very clear that the majority of managers who are those who are deploying the algorithmic hiring system, the scheduling tool or whatever, they have not necessarily received the training in how this system works, how do we explain it, what are the instructions, where has it been trained, etc., etc. So to really get inclusive governance, and I'm going to end here with a little snippet here from a co-governance guide that I've created, we need to focus on these 7 themes. And this is both on the sides of the workers, but also, of course, of the deploying managers. Firstly, transparency. Many, many workers across the world tell me, even in the GDPR, where they have the legal right to know, that they do not know what systems, digital systems, the management is deploying. Now, in Ontario, the new bill there, now employers are obliged to tell. So are they in Europe? Problem is, they don't. So transparency has to go up, but also, and under this first point here is, a lot of the deploying companies need to negotiate carefully with their suppliers and in the public sector in their procurement contracts. We are seeing a very unfortunate tendency now that the developers of these technologies are hiding behind trade secrets or intellectual property to not reveal the source code and not adapt the code or the algorithms. So this needs to be in focus. Secondly, we need to deal with what I call managerial fuzz. And managerial fuzz is precisely this thing that, as Stephanie said, the CEO, the CTO, the COO might have said, we need this new system, the competitors have it, but then it gets trickled down through the managerial layers. It might be a local HR department who's deploying this tool, and who is actually responsible for what. Here, it should be made very clear between the managerial layers who is responsible for the ongoing governance. How do we ensure that this system is not learning to do the wrong thing? A lot of the scandals we see across the world in both the private and public sector are due to the fact that these systems were never governed. If they were, the mistakes and the discrimination and biases would have been found out way before it hit the public eye. So that needs to be made very clear. Then it needs to be made very clear, especially in regards to workers or algorithmic management of workers, is what are their rights of redress? Now, of course, you will not have any rights of redress if you don't know what systems are deployed. That's number one there. But this should be really, really clear. What inferences are being made? How is the data sets and the inferences being compared to others? What are your rights to complain about this, to adapt to change? This is, of course, highly linked to data protection and rights. Now, across the world, to a certain extent, accepting the GDPR, workers have very, very few protections in data protection regulation. This is because mainly 99% of all data protection regulations, they rely on informed consent as the legal basis for processing workers' data. In Europe, not. In Europe, they say that due to the power imbalance between a laborer and the manager, you were never free to give your consent. Yet in the vast, vast majority of data protection laws, it is informed consent, which is the legal basis for processing data. Canada, going back to them right now, are proposing, I think it's Article 23 in their new law, that even private employers, private sector employers can do what they want with workers' data, and they don't even have to inform them. This is a step backwards. Fifthly, we need to have processes for identifying harms and benefits. What we see around the world is the marginalized are being further marginalized by these systems. The discrimination and bias inside them is really not doing us any favors in relation to an inclusive and diverse labor market. How do we start identifying these before they actually harm? And how do we, as Stephanie's report is all about, promote the benefits of these technologies? The sixth and second last one is adjustments. How do we adjust? What should we adjust in these systems? What does this inclusive governance body actually want to have adjusted? It is not their responsibility to know whether this technically can be done. That should be left to the technicians and the developers. But what if the developers come back and say, we can only do this to 85% accuracy? Will this be an acceptable mode of adjustment, so to speak? But of course, number 6 is linked to number 1. If you have not ensured in your contract with your suppliers that you have the right to demand adjustments if harms or other unintended consequences are identified, well, then of course, you have a big problem here. What should be the company policy there if harms are detected and the system cannot be rectified? Well, from my point of view, the system should be taken off the table. And then lastly, the co-governance one. How do we ensure that both management and labor have the capacities and the capabilities to actually govern these technologies? How do we know what we should know? And in that, how do we then co-govern these systems so that exactly as Stephanie's report is saying, that we promote the benefits and limit the harms? And with that, I'm going to say thank you, and here are my details. If any of you would like to chat or follow me later, back to you, Katja.
Christina, thank you so much for this powerful reminder of the complexities being introduced inside the deploying companies. It's not anymore just management workers interacting. There is all these intermediaries, developers, integrators. And yeah, the lack of capacity is like so real and gives me just the pause of my breath, realizing how much capacity building is needed. Thank you for this reminder. We're moving into Q&A now. We have about 30 minutes left. I'm going to turn it over to John to ask his question. And for any of you in the audience who would like to add your questions into the discussions, please just post them into Q&A, or you can also raise your hand. All of you mentioned some of the issues that exist around narratives and around misunderstandings of AI's impact on job quality. And Stephanie's report in particular really complicates the story, often being told about AI, that it's going to free us up from dull and dangerous jobs, free up our time for creative pursuits, for people to capitalize on their uniquely human skills and abilities. And now what we're seeing, in the at least in the cases of workers that Stephanie talked to, is something very different. And so the question to all of you is like, what are some of the other narratives that we should challenge? What are some other uncontested myths that exist? And Laura, I maybe would love to start with you. And I know your most recent report is just this brilliant encyclopedia of categorization of different types of impacts. So as you were mapping it and creating this categorization system, what else did you encounter that you think people commonly misunderstand? And then would love to also hear from everyone who'd like to add.
Sure, Katja, yes, you're very right. And I think Stephanie in her report already highlights a few of these myths or misunderstandings, right? One of them being that there's something predetermined or something inherently about this technology that is set on a specific course and that will certainly have this impact, which of course it doesn't, and choices matter a lot, and she shows that. I think another one that she showed, and you mentioned just now in your introduction, is that AI will give humans superpower or make them superhuman or something like that. You've already showed how that is not necessarily the case. I think a few other ones that I came across is that, well, if it's not something inherent about the technology that's predetermined, maybe there are specific types of technologies. Some of them are more harmful than others. That's also this idea that circulates sometimes, that as long as it's regular statistics or if it's a rule-based system, then there's no harm because it's not a black box and we can know what it's doing. It's only those ML, deep learning things that we don't really understand, those are the ones that are dangerous. That's one assumption that I will discredit. And another one is, well, if it's not the type of algorithm, then it's certainly the type of how it's applied in a physical manifestation. Like robots will automate away jobs, while Google Glasses will support the operator 4.0 in the factory of the future type situation. Well, none of those assumptions are right. So it doesn't matter which algorithm it is or how it's manifested in some sort of physical thing. What matters is what kind of organizational function the AI aims to automate. Does it aim to automate production? That's what we typically assume under automation. Or does it aim to automate management functions, which are actually also a huge part of the functions of the organization, right? If it aims to automate management functions, then we call it algorithmic management. And then in my research, we really show that depending on what types of algorithmic management the application addresses, the impacts will be different. Is it aimed to automate scheduling in the organization, or to give work instructions like the example I already gave, or for monitoring, performance evaluation, discipline, feedback? All of those management functions can be automated, and all of them will have different job quality impacts, or have impacts on different aspects of job quality. But in general, we do tend to see that the more directive, the more harmful. So if the system is used to give support, to give input to a human, and then the human gets to make the decision, whether it is on the scheduling or on the performance evaluation or whatnot, then the harms tend to be less, or there can even be benefits. Don't forget that also these systems often are designed with the best intentions and then end up being quite harmful, right? So the more directive, the more harmful, and the more supportive, the less risk for harms.
Yeah, please, Christina.
If I could chime in there, because there's something fascinating going on. And that is that we suddenly think we can peek into the future. So predictive algorithms, which are causing so much harm. And I have not been able, and any of you on this call have an example of where predictive algorithm actually did no harm for anybody, let me know. It is fascinating how this speaks into the laziness of, or what Tim Wu called the tyranny of convenience. Oh, if I can predict that somebody's likely to leave my company, or if I can predict they're likely to commit fraud, then things would be much easier for me. Now, the thing is, as I said, I have not been able to find one single example where these predictive algorithms, when the object of them is human behavior, that works. I think we need to distinguish between AI that deals with objects, is this a car, a cancer cell, or whatever it may be, and then those that are directed towards manipulating, analyzing, or predicting human behavior. And that, I think, is a distinction which we need to draw out far, far more.
Jumping in briefly with something that I'd say probably isn't a myth so much as a mindset, but what I would challenge and didn't explicitly challenge in the report is the idea that user experience or UI research is enough to address a lot of the questions or challenges that we're highlighting. I think it's a huge and important step. And one of the things that I found really interesting in one of the groups that I spoke with is that the data annotators in sub-Saharan Africa were a part of a research team that was effectively doing UX and UI work. And so they were able to surface all of these important changes in the technologies that they were using. Hugely important to get them involved in that. And they took a lot of pride in that work. But they also were able to say, if I take a step back from this role, I can identify so many other things about this technology where maybe we can make the process go better. Maybe we could make the quality of the job go better. Maybe we can make it easier for me to get into a kind of flow state where I'm working quickly or efficiently and really enjoying what I'm doing. All of these different things that kind of go above and beyond that UX or UI attitude and into process design and operational design, or even what the function of the technology is to begin with, as Laura was pointing out. I think the further we get away from that kind of, UX or UI focused mindset, where that's kind of the only place that we involve workers, and start to get them throughout the chain, the better we'll see results for workers as well as for businesses.
And then let me ask kind of a closing question, which I recognize is the most difficult one, around picking up on something Christina mentioned, that very often technologies being introduced in the workplace are not really about productivity or efficiency. They're about shifting power within the workplace, and kind of turn the framing a little bit. Laura highlighted that nothing about the technology itself makes it inherently safe or beneficial in terms of AI job quality. But is there something that should give us a pause and should, be treated by us as a red flag of, okay, if this is happening, this is probably about shifting power, not to the benefit of worker? Are there some clues we can get, and something that we should maybe look at in, with regulation, or at least encourage AI developers and deployers to be mindful of? So I would love for you to leave our listeners with this wish for the technology of the future. What should we try to avoid, if there is anything per se that is inherently potentially not benefiting workers' power?
Is that over to me?
Whoever wants to start.
All right, I've got a wish list. So Laura, you mentioned several EU laws. Now there's one consensus on a geopolitical or political level which is arising, which concerns me deeply, is in the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, in the EU AI Act, in the G7, the G20, the OECD, etc. And it is as if our politicians are falling back on regulating AI through market access, but through standards and certifications. None of the discussions at all include any requirements for inclusive governance. So they're going to market certify something that by nature is fluid and changeable, without then demanding that it is inclusively governed. This, for me, so that has to change. We need inclusive governance as law and a mandatory requirement. Secondly, we need to capacity build. And it is not good just to say the workers need to know what they should know, so should the employers. And in that way, we can have a little bit more informed deployment of these technologies than currently is the case. And then thirdly, we have to uphold the human rights. Now, a lot of these systems are abusing the human rights. Let's go back to 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that every human being is born free and equal in dignity and rights. This is not the case if you no longer seeing a job announcement online because you a priori have been deemed unfit by an algorithmic system. So we need to protect our human rights, and we need to ensure, as part of that, and as part of the human rights, that union busting, which is extremely large in the United States, is forbidden and is upheld by law to be unlawful. And that those 3.5, 4 things are on my wish list. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to try to chip in, but like you said, it's a very difficult question. Yeah, you asked if there's something that should give us pause or something up front that we could say if would be harmful when we're designing it. So I'm not saying it's easy to measure, because it's not, but any technology that aims to simplify jobs aims to make workers more replaceable. And more replaceable workers mean less power to the workforce. So it's not always easy upfront to quantify this. You can measure it afterwards, but to be proactive about it, I'm going to refer back then to Christina's suggestions about inclusive governance. And also I want to add on to her point about building capacity. It's not only the workers that need to understand AI, maybe also the AI developers should understand more about human rights and job quality. Maybe that could be something that gets integrated into their curricula as well.
Truly.
And those are both wonderful answers. And there's not much more I can add beyond that. I'll throw out one last technology that I think would give me, or at least use, which gives me a bit of pause, which is a lot of the applications of surveillance in workplaces. This frequently takes place without workers' permission, without their knowledge of where their data is being used, without their ability to reap any benefits from, for instance, particularly effective approaches they might have to do their work that are later kind of sown algorithmically throughout the rest of a workplace. And it's also often used as a chilling effect for worker organization. If you don't know what communications are being monitored, you don't know who you can talk to about what, and not be retaliated against. And so there's a number of various pernicious ways in which surveillance is used in workplaces. And that's before we even get into things like, stressful target setting and that kind of thing. I'd say in general, I'd put a question mark next to that one and almost always look more closely if it's something that's turning up in my own workplace.
Thank you. These are such great insights. I really want to thank Christina, Laura, Stephanie for sharing your work with us today, and to everyone who dialed in at different times of day or evening or morning, and everyone who will be watching in the future. Please stay tuned for more of this work and more outputs of the Shared Prosperity Initiative. Follow the work of Laura and Christina, very important work that they're doing. And thank you again, everyone, very much for joining us today.